What started out as rumors and hearsay in the Formula One paddock has now been confirmed as fact. Red Bull Racing did in fact breach the 2021 cost cap that was imposed on teams by the FIA and Formula One. Now, you would remember that 2021 was the first year when F1 would be trying out an official budget cap. The long-term aim of this, of course, being to make it a more level playing field and to also curb overspending and therefore making all of the teams on the paddock more sustainable for the long-term future. However, there's also a lot of questions now being raised about what exactly will be done now that it is confirmed, at least from the side of the FIA, that Red Bull did indeed breach the budget cap. What has been Red Bull's reaction to all of this? And is there actually a chance that we could very well see a reversal of the 2021 title deciding race at Abu Dhabi of 2021? And could we very well be seeing a champion retroactively stripped of the title? That's something that we're going to be addressing in this video along with many other pointers, because this is quite the interesting story, and I do believe it would require some background to go over what exactly has happened and what it is that could be happening now that this breach has been confirmed. Let's start from the beginning, and obviously, we know for a fact that 2021 was supposed to be officially the first year when all teams would be operating within a budget cap. Now, this was put on for the first time, as I mentioned, to actually ensure that the playing field is a bit more level, but there were always going to be teething problems in the short term, and that would, of course, potentially include teams breaching the regulations or finding ways to actually creatively account for overspending. As has been confirmed, Red Bull and Aston Martin are the two teams who have actually breached the cap, but of course there's not that much focus on Aston Martin Racing because they were only the 7th or 8th best team on the grid, whereas Red Bull, whilst missing out on the Constructors' Championship in a whisker, did secure the World Drivers' Championship of 2021. That was the first of 2 titles that Verstappen has won, because remember, he sealed the title of 2022 as well. Naturally, the next question people would be asking is what would be the punishment or what is the penalty for committing said breach? Now, that's the interesting thing. There were no pre-decided penalties for any of these breaches because the FIA and Formula One both realized the teams would actually then, be able to countenance the penalties versus, the risk or the reward that they could reap from actually breaching. Now, remember, Formula One is a sport of very fine margins, and a lot of times teams will knowingly break the rules knowing that the penalties in place don't really actually, let's say they're not that much of a hindrance. Example of that is when teams exceed, the number of quotas of engines or engine power units that they're allowed to put in cars, and they might get a 10 or 15 grid spot penalty. But if you're one of the fastest cars on the grid, you know that you can make up that pace and then go to the front of the grid anyway. So a lot of teams take that, which is why there were no pre-decided penalties, because most teams would decide that the risks are quote-unquote worth it and take the fine anyway. Because I mean, to be fair, if you win the title, if you win the Constructors' Championship, what's a small fine, hypothetically speaking? But that is why there were no pre-decided penalties, and we'll come to what the penalties could be in just a bit. But first, let's take a look at what it is that Red Bull Racing had to say. They put out a short and kind of terse statement on Twitter. This is just a summation of it. They said that, we note the findings of the report of the FIA with surprise and disappointment. Now, both of these are key words here because, again, as I said, it was a very strong reproach to what was actually put in place. Nevertheless, despite that, they say that our submission was below the cost cap limit, so we need to carefully review the FIA's findings. Now, on one hand, they say that they're surprised and disappointed, but they've also struck up a pretty conciliatory note saying that they do intend working on and working with the FIA on these findings to try and see what it is can be corrected. Now, the interesting part, of course, with all of this is that, what is the scale of the breach? Again, publicly that's not known, but there is one thing that I had mentioned earlier. First off, that any penalty that will be put in place, it's not actually pre-decided, so it will be decided as and when a breach is captured. So they haven't put pre-decided penalties in place because they don't want teams to actually take on those penalties or feel like they're worth it. Now, Red Bull's breach as such is a minor breach, but a minor breach itself doesn't really cover a lot. So according to the regulations of the cost cap that were put in place, a minor breach could be anything between a few £100,000 to all the way up to $7 million. So in fact, a few $100,000 to all the way up to $7 million. Now, that is a lot of money, because that in itself, and we don't know, again, I have to stress on the fact that we don't publicly know what exactly the nature of the breach is, but even if they've spent about close to $7 million over budget, that is a significant amount of research and development, and of course, new parts that could potentially swing the title. Now, of all the punishments that are in place, let's quickly go over what it is that could happen. They could, potentially be, disqualified from running in a certain session of a certain race. They could be, even retroactively, they could very well be points stripped, or in the worst case, if they find that the infringement is really bad, they could actually be stripping a title away from the team, assuming they've won the title, which in Red Bull's case, they of course did. They won the World Drivers' Championship. So there is legitimately that danger in that regard. But will it actually happen? It seems, at least what I would say, that is definitely not out of the question. It seems unlikely that the FIA and of course Formula One would want to open up that particular can of worms of retroactively changing the results of a championship. But that's not the only punishment they can take. They can actually impose a stricter cap on teams in the future. So say for instance, if Red Bull are over the 7 million cap this year, then they'll be docked $7 million from next year's budget cap, which means that if they're allowed to spend $145 million, they'll only be allowed to spend 138 as punishment, or they could actually be limited aerodynamic testing. That is also something that can impact a team, because obviously the more testing hours you have, more you can experiment, the more that you can, in theory, make your car better and faster. So those seem the likelier punishments, but it is worth noting, something that people within Formula One's circles or corridors of power have been saying about the regulations beforehand. And I want to take you back to a very interesting quote made by Ross Brawn, who is of course currently the managing director of Formula One. He stated very clearly all the way back in 2018 or 19 that the cost cap that we're going to be implementing, it has teeth. If you fraudulently breach the financial regulations, you will be losing your championship. So it has serious consequences. Now, again, I have to stress on the fact that we don't know for a fact that Red Bull have in fact fraudulently breached the regulations. So they might not very well be losing their championship. But even if they've overspent and have tried to cover it up in a clever way, it is actually important that they be punished as severely as was possible based on the level of offense that they've put out there. Why do I say that? Because this is the first proper breach of the financial regulations, or of course of the cost cap that has been put in place. And if teams find that Red Bull get away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist, it will embolden more of them to breach the regulations in search of extra lap time or gains, which will also benefit them not just in the short run but in the long run. So this, if you ask me, is a pivotal time for the FIA and Formula One's decision makers. Do you want to actually just let the team go away scot-free or get away with very light punishment, or do you want to punish them strictly to ensure that there are no more such mistakes that are made in the future by other teams, that they don't think of necessarily breaching the cost cap and they don't think of putting today's gains in place and prioritizing today's gains, and potentially saying that, if any fine or anything comes our way, we'll deal with it as long as we're winning right now. So that for me is the key part. It's not the fact that Red Bull have gone over budget. That could very well be an accounting mistake. It could very well be them not accounting for certain things the way it should have been. It might just very well be a small figure, because again, as I note, we don't know the actual figure that is involved yet. But whatever the degree of crime that has been committed, the degree of punishment should be in place accordingly, because otherwise it will render the regulations around the cost cap pretty toothless and not in fact show that it has teeth, as Ross Brawn claimed in the past. But enough about how I feel about this. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and of course tap the bell icon so you know when we're going live or uploading a new video. Then you can go ahead and follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram as well. We're on all those platforms, and don't forget to download the AajTak app. Thank you all once again for joining us. As always, I've been Shane Dias. I hope to see you all with us through the day, but for now, goodbye.